Good day. I am Datano T. Luna, a second year PhD Applied Linguistics student. With my colleagues, we have Ma'am Baidona S. Aliman, who is our leader, Ma'am Vernie C. Hassan, Ma'am Baisemia Algerenti Mamalimping, Ma'am Crisanta B. Book, Ma'am Rosemary D. Katahom, and Ma'am Jovena A. Yasin. So today we are going to present the Ayer versus Geach on ethical statements. These two non-philosophers have two different claims and perspectives on ethical statements. Let us now see and listen to the video presentations of my colleagues, focusing on Ayer's school of thought and Geach's in regard with the ethical statements. The presentations are continuous, her proponents starting with the introduction of the philosopher, the further discussion of their claims, and finally the conclusions. Let's have the presentations on Ayers followed by Geach's.
Good morning, Sir Law. Good morning, classmates. We are tasked to discuss Ayer versus Geach on ethical statements. So, let's see what are the claims of these two philosophers. So, who is A.J. Ayer? A.J. Ayer, or Sir Alfred Jules Ayer, was a British philosopher best known for his promotion and advancement of logical positivism and the verification principle. His first book, Language, Truth and Logic, published in 1936, came to be regarded as the basic English language work on logical positivism. Many contemporary philosophers advocate various forms of empiricism. So, there are few who believe that empirical sciences and their methods are our primary source of knowledge. And for some, anything contingently true to be knowable must rest on a foundation of empirical evidence. So, logical positivism of A.J. Ayer is an extreme and systematic expression of this second idea, that anything contingently true to be knowable must rest on a foundation of empirical evidence. Now let's define first what is positivism and logical positivism. Let's see what's the difference between the two. When we use our five senses, our taste, touch, sight, smell, and sound, to determine the truth, that is positivism. When we use our five senses, our taste, touch, sight, smell, and sound, plus we use logic or mathematics to determine the truth, we are doing logical positivism. Now, what is logical positivism? Logical positivism holds that a declarative sentence or a proposition or an assertion is made true or false by two and only two factors, logic and empirical evidence. So when we say logic, it has something to do with our reasoning, whether our reasoning is correct or valid. It is about those arguments that we do to support our reasoning. So that is logic. And logic is happening in our daily lives. Every day we use logic or logical thinking. On the other hand, empirical evidence are information acquired through observations or experimentations. So for a proposition, for a claim to be considered meaningful or true or false, it needs to satisfy these two factors. And this process is what we call the principle of verification or the verification principle by Ayer. If such claims could be shown to be neither confirmable nor disconfirmable by a combination of logic and factual evidence, they must be meaningless. This means that any utterances or any claim that does not satisfy the principle of verification is said to be nonsense or meaningless. So this sentence made Ayer concerned about ethical statement. The sentence is, you were wrong to steal that money. If there are two people who will debate on this statement, typically they will debate by relevant facts, by presenting relevant facts. However, they could eventually agree on all the relevant facts they presented, but they might still disagree about whether this statement, you were wrong to steal that money, is true. Here, Ayer is trying to show us that his central claims are about language, not what's right or what's wrong, but our talking about what's right or wrong. So this will be further elaborated by my groupmates.
Good morning, everyone. I will be sharing to you my topic on Ayer's view on ethical statements. As stated in A.G. Ayer's chapter of Language, Truth and Logic, that judgment of value insofar as they are not scientific statements, are not in the literal sense significant but are simply expressions of emotion which can be neither true or false. Or to simplify it, meaning to make a moral judgment is to express an emotion. In 1936, Ayer expounded the theory of emotivism. Emotivism is an ethical theory which says that moral statements are just expressions of feelings and/or emotions. Here, ethical statements cannot be proved true or false. When we say ethical statements, these are statements that includes ideals that are important to a person, such as honesty or integrity. In the statement, a person defines these values and describes what they will and not to live by them. Ayer cited an example in his book. According to him, this sentence has no factual meaning. The stealing money is wrong. That is, it expresses no proposition which can be either true or false. It is as if stealing money, where the shape and thickness of the exclamation marks show by a suitable convention that a special sort of moral disapproval is the feeling which is expressed. It is clear that there is nothing said here which can be true or false. Another example is when one subjectivist says lying is bad, they're giving the information that they disapproved of lying. If another subjectivist says lying is good, they're giving the information that they approved of lying. Since according to the subjectivist view, both are reporting their own personal feelings, there isn't actually anything that they disagree about. When an emotivist says lying is bad, they're giving the instruction, don't tell lies. While an emotivist who says lying is good is giving the instruction, do tell lies. And we can see that there is a clear disagreement between them. The facts on emotivism: that moral judgment are not truth of, but rather are expressions of sentiments of approval or disapproval. That ethical statements cannot be translated into statements of empirical fact, that is, no natural reduction of ethical concepts is possible. That ethical statements are synthetic, they are not analytic, that is, they aren't true by definition. Emotivism also agrees with the statement as it identifies that ethical statements are more statements of opinion and can never be found to be a fact, which therefore makes them meaningless. Why does Ayer claim that ethical claims do not have any meaning? He agrees with the subjectivist in saying that ethical statements are necessarily related to individual attitudes. But he says that they lack truth value because they cannot be properly understood as proportions about those attitudes. He thinks ethical sentences are just expressions, not assertion or approval. There are some bad points of emotivism. Emotivism became unpopular with philosophers because the theory that led the emotivists to think that moral sentiments were meaningless has fallen from favor. Less technically, if expressing moral judgment is really no more than expressing one's personal opinion, there doesn't seem any useful basis for arguing about moral values. In practical terms, emotivism falls down because it isn't very satisfying. Even most philosophers think moral statements are more than just expressions of feelings. And it's perfectly possible to imagine an ethical debate in which neither party has an emotion to express. Ayer's formulation of ideas is still unrefined, and most philosophers would agree on it. But the theory remains attractive in its own right as an ethical theory. It has been proposed and defended in much more detail with more sophistication by later philosophers, including Charles Stevenson of 1944 and Alan Gibbard of 1990. Ayer is also making a semantic claim with a proper interpretation of ethical statements. When we say semantic claims, these are disagreements that arises if the parties involved disagree about the definition of a word or phrase, not because they disagree on material facts, but rather because they disagree on the definitions of a word essential to formulating the claim at issue. Ayer is also making a semantic claim. He insisted that semantic theory must account in a uniform and systematic way for the meaningful instructions of syntactic constituents. Meaning, it is not possible to make local and more or less ad hoc changes without considering the systematic consequences. One must consider the impact of the change on the underlying system of the semantic rules. In the next chapter or in the next presentation, we will be knowing the semantics of simple addition and division that is to be reported by my colleague. This ends my report, and thank you.
So the crucial point can be illustrated with the semantics of simple addition and division. So the rule for interpreting alpha plus beta, for instance, where alpha and beta are numerical terms, is that alpha and beta, the notation or semantic interpretation of alpha plus beta is the result of adding alpha and beta. We take the annotation of the component terms and add these two numbers. We can say that so far so good, but suppose that we have here arithmetical syntax functions division by 0. So allowing terms like this, we have to treat these terms, as you can see here, as anomalous. So perhaps we can say that this term have no denotations. But if we stop there, our semantic rule for addition will be defective. So because now it doesn't cover cases like this. So where one of the terms has no denotation. So in order for us to continue, we can now revise the rule and say that alpha plus beta denotes nothing if either alpha or beta fails to denote, and that otherwise it denotes the sum of alpha and beta. But the difficulty doesn't stop there. What about terms like this? So the standard rule for identity is that alpha is equal to beta. It is true if only alpha is identical to beta. So we have to modify this rule, and the natural way to do that is to say that alpha is equal to beta is neither true nor false if either of the two, the alpha or the beta, fails to denote. Okay? Or otherwise, it is only true if and only alpha and beta are both the same.
A pleasant morning, everyone. Our team will be presenting Geach views on ethical statement. I am Giovanna Yasin. Together with me are my colleagues, Ms. Chris Book and Ms. Vernie Hassan, who will also present their respective topics after my presentation. Let's get to know first about Geach and his works. Peter Thomas Geach was born on March 1916 in London. He was a distinguished English philosopher of the 20th century. The earliest philosophical influence on Geach was his father, who taught philosophy for the colonial administration in India and provided the young Geach with a systematic education in logic. He was a professor of logic at the University of Leeds in England. His areas of interest were philosophical logic, ethics, history of philosophy, philosophy of religion, and the theory of identity. He was a formidable logician and happened to be married to one of the 20th century's leading English language philosophers, Elizabeth Anscombe. He was best known for his contributions to the theoretical philosophy. Most of his more than 100 papers and a dozen books are on logic, philosophy of language, and metaphysics. The two most profound influences on Geach thought were probably Anscombe, with whom he also co-authored in some of his works, and the Catholic faith, to which both have converted independently of each other during their studies. Geach's moral philosophy is strongly influenced by Catholicism. This holds for his theory of the virtues, as well as his views on questions in applied ethics. He made significant contributions to ethics. He delivers sharp analysis and powerful objections against influential schools. He also presents arguments that are always clear and simple, that leave the reader wondering why no one before Geach detected the problems he points out. In the early 1960s, Peter Geach pressed the problem facing the philosophical position on ethical statement proposed by Ayer, which is known as expressivism. One notable problem facing Ayer's expressivism is that of providing an adequate compositional semantics, of accounting for the meanings of complex sentences, and doing so on the basis of the meanings of their parts. Our next speakers will present an in-depth analysis on Geach's perspectives on ethical statement, as well as his contradictions to the central tenet of expressivism, particularly with that of the notions of Ayer. Once again, good morning.
Good morning, everyone. My topic is in continuation with Ma'am Juvena's presentation. Talking about moral language, what does make it true or false raises issues. But seriously, what does make it true or false? What kind of property is wrongness or goodness exactly? Let us have Geach's points through the lens of Freddie Geach's problem to explain this. But first, what is Freddie Geach's problem? Freddie Geach's problem is otherwise called as the embedding problem. It is used to test as the main test to understand rationality in non-cognitivist theories, particularly the expressivist. In particular, Geach used his own test to attack non-cognitivist claims to give significance to moral reasoning. Briefly, the Freddie Geach problem claims that sentences that express moral judgment can form part of semantically complex sentences. It means that moral language has logical properties. Let's take for an example, this one. It's definitely inconsistent. Stealing is not bad. Another one is, we can also form valid arguments out of moral language. Example, sentence 1, if stealing is bad, then murder is bad. Sentence 2, stealing is bad. Therefore, murder is bad. According to Geach, the sentence stealing is bad has the same meaning regardless of whether it occurs on its own or as the antecedent of if stealing is bad, then murder is bad. This must be so since we may derive, therefore murder is bad. From them, and both by modus ponens without any fallacy of equivocation. So if we say modus ponens, it means method of affirming. It is a rule of inference used to draw logical conclusions which states that if P is true and if P implies Q, then Q is true. Example, if I study hard, then I will get an A. I will study hard. Therefore, I will get an A. Talking about fallacy of equivocation, this means that this is a fallacy that occurs when different meanings of word or phrase are used in argument. The resulting ambiguity leads to an incorrect conclusion being drawn, and this is otherwise called as semantic fallacy. Example, all trees have bark. Every dog barks. Therefore, every dog is a tree. Going back to moral language, if we analyze moral language in terms of what makes it true or false, then you can explain this, for example, as if stealing is bad, is true, then stealing is not bad cannot also be true. Another example, telling the lies is wrong. If telling the lies is wrong, then getting your little brother to tell lies is also wrong. Therefore, telling your little brother to tell lies is wrong. According to Geach, telling the lies is wrong has the same meaning regardless of whether it occurs on its own or as antecedent of if telling the lies is wrong, then getting your little brother to tell lies is also wrong. This must be so since we may derive, therefore telling your little brother to tell lies is wrong from them through method of affirmation without any fallacy of equivocation. From the example cited, Geach wants to point that truth conditional semantics can explain the logical properties of moral language.
Good morning, Doc Lau. Good morning, classmates. I am Fornisi Hassan. I am the third reporter in favor of Geach ethical statement. Geach paper is quite general. It covers many topics, and the criticism of expressivism is bundled together with similar criticisms of other philosophical theories. But Geach's arguments against Ayer's expressivist account is quite simple. He invites us to consider ethical sentences when they occur as antecedents of conditional. We'll go back first on Ayer's claim. For Ayer, moral language does not try to describe, therefore, it has no truth condition. Further, Ayer agrees with subjectivists in saying that ethical statements are necessarily related to individual attitudes. But he says they lack truth value. Why? Because they cannot be properly understood as propositions about those attitudes. Examples: stealing is wrong, another, charity is good. So for Ayer, unless logical or empirical verification is possible, these two examples are untrue or not true but meaningless and may thus be excluded or ignored. Since it has no truth condition, for Ayer, It's neither true or false. On the other hand, Geach claimed ethical sentences, when they occur as antecedent conditional, then it is meaningful or meaningful. Example: if stealing is wrong, so is robbery. If you should not steal, you should not rob. So we found that in these two examples, there are two antecedents conditional. And these examples of Geach are perfectly meaningful because it participates in logically valid inferences just as a normal conditional. So, if stealing is wrong, so is robbery. But stealing is wrong. Yes, we all know that stealing is wrong. Therefore, robbery there is also wrong. Considering the point of Geach, for him, conditions for the assertion of a sentence can't account for its meaning. Why? Because when one sentence occurs as a constituent of a larger sentence, we require a meaning to determine the meaning of containing sentence. So before I end up my report, we are going to unlock first what is condition for assertion. So assertion, it is an allegation or proclamation of something, often as the result of opinion as opposed to fact. An example of this is a person who stands up boldly in a meeting with a point in opposition to the presenter. So, a person who is opposing on the presenter's point of view despite having valid evidence to support his statement, then that is assertion. That's all for today. Thank you and good morning, everyone.
Belief is a mental attitude of acceptance or assent toward a proposition without the full intellectual knowledge required to guarantee its truth. Every human being has been created to think, to reason out, to speak, and to make his own belief. A belief that is distinguished according to its degree of certainty, a surmise or suspicion, an opinion, or a conviction. Moreover, a belief becomes knowledge only when the truth of a proposition becomes evident to the believer. Just like Ayer, he proposed his well-known exposition of logical positivism. Although ethics was not really his primary philosophical interest, he presents and defends views about ethical statements because of semantic considerations, which need to be understood in the context of empiricists' tendencies in philosophy. In his logical positivism, he emphasized the principle of verification, which means every literally meaningful statement is either empirically verifiable or analytic. In his emotivism example statement, stealing is wrong, he argues that the statement doesn't appear anything analytically true or anything empirically verifiable. Thus, his suggestion is that such an utterance, rather than describing how the world is, instead merely express his attitudes, that's feelings and sentiments about the world. He agrees with subjectivists in saying that ethical statements are necessarily related to individual attitudes, but he says they lack truth value because they cannot be properly understood as propositions about those attitudes. He also thinks ethical sentences are expressions, not assertions of approval. Assertions including tone of voice, body language, and various other verbal statements. He sees ethical statements as expressions of the latter sort. So the phrase theft is wrong is a non-proportional statement or non-proportional sentence that is an expression of disapproval, but it's not equivalent to the proposition I disapprove of theft. On the other hand, the interconnectedness of semantic rules and comprehensive consequences of small changes to semantic systems have been well known to logicians and semanticists ever since Frege. This is the thought behind Peter Geach's critique of Ayer's proposal. That's why the so-called Frege-Geach problem arose. He attributes that Frege point in which the sentences can occur in freestanding, which means asserted, and context and embedded, and unasserted, which means context, without changing in meaning. Furthermore, the sentences that expresses moral judgments can form part of semantically complex sentences in a way that an expressivists cannot easily explain. According to Geach, the sentence telling the lies is wrong has the same meaning regardless of whether it occurs on its own or as the antecedent of if telling the lies is wrong, then telling your little brother to tell lies is also wrong. Now, it is important for us, especially we are soon to become a linguists, to signify our own belief. However, it is also necessary to make these school of thoughts and claims as our blueprints in order for us to be more effective and relevant in terms of language acquisition and learning. Both claims have impact on us, and it depends on us how we and what we believe in. Thank you so much for listening and have a great day.